Hello everybody, my name is Martin and you're watching Affinity for Commander. Today we have our first non-webcam gameplay video to be recorded since the latest UK lockdown, and I've got to say it was really good to be sitting across the table from real people for a change. Not that we haven't had fun playing with people online, but nothing compares to the real thing. But before we get into it, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our incredible patrons listed on screen. We are only able to continue making videos because of your support and cannot express how grateful we are to all of you. Also, if you use any of these websites for your card game related goodies, then be sure to use our affiliate links in the description below. It won't cost you any extra, but it really helps out the channel. And if you're buying from Flipside Gaming, be sure to use the promo code Affinity at the checkout to get 10% off orders over $10. And finally, if you like the look of my Japanese style altered art sleeves, then be sure to check out altersleeves.com where you can find many more designs like them. There's a link in our video description, and you can even credit us as the ones who sent you if you want to help us out. But that's enough of that, let's take a look at our combatants' opening hands. I am playing my Akiri Lineslinger and Ardenn Intrepid Archaeologist deck, which aims to win by attaching a load of equipment to my creatures and swinging for lethal damage. I keep an opening hand containing Commander's Plate, Path to Exile, Rayav Master Smith, Loxodon Warhammer, Wylith Soul of Steel, Evolving Wilds and the Plains.
Phil is playing his Esika God of the Tree 5-colour enchantments deck, which has access to a lot of powerful cards that Selesnya band decks are unable to play. His starting hand is made up of Sterling Grove, Nexus Wardens, Verduin Enchantress, Path of Ancestry, Overgrown Tomb, Temple Garden, and a Swamp.
Eric is playing his Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow Unblockable Creatures deck, which runs a ton of library manipulation and high mana value spells to make the most out of his commander's second ability. He keeps an opening hand of Demonic Tutor, Legacies of Lore, Spellseeker, Jace Wielder of Mysteries, Dimir Aqueduct, Underground River, and Watery Grave.
And finally, Danny is playing his The Mimeoplasm Graveyard Manipulation deck. He aims to put as many powerful creatures into his graveyard as possible and then reanimate them, or have his commander become a copy of them. Danny's opening hand consists of Assassin's Trophy, Sultai Ascendancy, Colonian Hydra, It That Betrays, Llanowar Wastes, Reflecting Pool, and Mana Confluence.
Phil wins the die roll and starts the game off by playing Path of Ancestry. With nothing more to do, he passes to Eric.
Eric pays 2 life to play an untapped Watery Grave, which he then taps to cast Tormented Soul. Pleased with his speedy start, Eric passes the turn.
I play Evolving Wilds and end my turn.
Danny plays Llanowar Wastes and passes to Phil.
Phil pays 2 life to have his Temple Garden enter untapped and then casts a rather spicy Sterling Grove. Out of mana, he passes the turn.
Eric plays Underground River and then moves to combat. Here he attacks Phil with his Unblockable Spirit, but before damage, pays 1 life to his Painland in order to ninjutsu out his commander, Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow. Tormented Soul is returned to Eric's hand and Phil is dealt a single point of damage by Eric's commander. This triggers her ability and Eric reveals the top card of his library to be Mox Amber, dealing everybody else a whopping 0 damage.
Ooh, that's gotta sting.
Eric puts the Mox into his hand, moves to his second main phase, where he casts the Mana Rock and uses it to recast Tormented Soul. With nothing more to do, he ends his turn, and Martin responds by sacrificing his Evolving Wilds to put a mountain into play before proceeding to his turn.
I begin my turn by playing a Plains and then cast one of my commanders, Akiri Lineslinger. Out of mana, I pass to Danny.
Danny plays Breeding Pool, having the Shock land enter tapped, and passes the turn.
Phil plays a Swamp and casts Verduin Enchantress before ending his turn.
Eric starts his turn by tapping his Underground River, taking 1 damage to float a blue mana. Next he plays Dimir Aqueduct, returning the tapped Painland to his hand, and uses his floating mana to cast Mystical Tutor. Eric searches library for Peer into the Abyss, puts the spell on top of his library and moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with both of his creatures, dealing him 2 damage and triggering Yuriko's ability. Martin, Danny and Phil each take 7 damage as Eric puts Peer into the Abyss into his hand, and a rather pleased looking Eric moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he casts Legacy's Allure and points out that he could sacrifice it at any point to gain control of Martin's 0-powered commander.
Raise your hand if you've ever been personally victimised by obscure old magic cards.
Confident with his position in the game, Eric passes the turn.
In my turn I cast Commander's Plate, raising Akiri's power to 1 and out of range of Eric's enchantment for the time being.
That will show him.
Moving to combat, I attack Eric for 1 with my Vigilant Commander, and having yet to draw any more lands, I end my turn.
Danny plays Reflecting Pool and once again passes to Phil without casting anything. Martin and Phil shake their heads in disapproval, and Danny informs them that his hand is
pure gas as long as I get to turn 5.
Good luck with that, Danny boy.
Phil begins his turn by casting Nexus Wardens, and then plays a very pretty Ralgren Triome. Moving to combat, he attacks Eric with his Enchantress, dealing him 0 damage, but sending him a message of violence, which is just as effective really. With nothing more to do, Phil passes the turn.
In his upkeep, Eric puts a treasure counter on Legacy's Allure, once again making Akiri a legal target for the enchantment's ability.
Boo!
He then replays Underground River and moves to combat, once again attacking Danny with both of his creatures. Not wishing to take more damage from Yuriko's ability, Danny responds by casting Assassin's Trophy targeting Yuriko. Phil points out that Eric would still be able to ninjutsu his commander back into play, and Martin responds to Phil's words of wisdom by casting Path to Exile targeting Tormented Soul. Both creatures are removed from the battlefield, and Eric puts a swamp into play untapped and an island into play tapped. In his second main phase, Eric casts Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, paying 1 life to his Underground River in order to create 3 blue mana. He uses Jace's +1 ability, drawing a card, and having Martin mill 2. Both of these milled cards turn out to be lands, making Martin a very sad boy, and Eric ends his turn.
In my turn I cast Prowler's Helm, and with the spell on the stack, Eric sacrifices Legacy's Allure to gain control of my line-slinging core. He takes a moment to appreciate how pretty the altered artwork is, and with a tear in my eye, I pass to Danny.
Danny plays Mana Confluence and takes 1 damage to cast Sultai Ascendancy. Unable to do anything else, he passes the turn.
Phil plays Overgrown Tomb, paying 2 life to have the land enter untapped. He then casts his commander's reverse side, the Prismatic Bridge, gaining 2 life from his wardens and drawing a card of his Enchantress. With no mana remaining, Phil then ends his turn.
Eric starts his turn by activating Jace's +1 ability, drawing a card and once again making Martin mill the 2 lands that are on top of his deck.
This really isn't funny anymore.
Next he plays Halimar Depths and rearranges the top 3 cards of his library. Eric then casts Gudul Lurker, closely followed by Spellseeker. He uses her ETB to search his library for Cyclonic Rift, putting the pseudo board wipe into his hand, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with Akiri, dealing him 1 damage thanks to his Mox Amber. Everybody speculates why Eric didn't ninjutsu out his commander back into play, and with 3 mana still untapped, Eric passes to Martin.
I draw my first land of the game, a mountain, which I immediately play and tap to help cast my second commander, Ardenn Intrepid Archaeologist. Moving to combat, I attach both of my equipment to my core, giving him +3/+3, protection from blue, black and green, and unblockable to all non-wall creatures.
Not bad for an uncommon 3-drop.
I know, right? Satisfied that I'm not out of the game just yet, I pass the turn.
In his upkeep, Danny uses Sultai Ascendancy to put the Stitcher's Supplier and Torrent Elemental on top of his library into his graveyard. He then draws, plays Temple of the False God, and takes 1 damage from Mana Confluence in order to cast Muldrotha the Gravetide. Out of mana, he ends his turn.
The Prismatic Bridge triggers in Phil's upkeep, and he puts Nessian Wanderer into play this way. Not the best card to cheat into play, but hey, you can't argue with free. Next, Phil casts Temur Ascendancy, gaining 2 life from Nexus Wardens, and looks at the top 3 cards of his library with his Wanderer. He fails to find a land, putting the cards on the bottom of his library, draws a card with Verdure and Enchantress, and plays a fancy looking Wooded Foothills. Phil immediately sacrifices the land, lowering his life total by 3 to put Breeding Pool into play untapped from his library. Not yet finished, Phil casts Utopia Sprawl, enchanting his Breeding Pool. He draws, gains 2 life, and puts Zargoth Triumph into his hand with Nessian Wanderer's trigger. Given that the rest of us now have blockers, Phil elects not to attack and instead passes to Eric.
Eric begins his turn by activating Jace's +1 ability, drawing a card and making Martin mill 2 cards.
Yet another land in the bin.
Eric then plays Seat of the Synod, boosting Akiri's power by 1, and then moves to combat. He attacks Martin with his unblockable Salamander, and before damage occurs, ninjutsus in his commander for a second time. Martin takes 1 damage from Yuriko, and Eric reveals top card of his library to be Culling the Weak. Martin, Danny and Phil each take a single point of damage, and Eric moves to his second main phase. Here he casts Demonic Tutor, searching his library for Tetsuko Umizawa, Fugitive. He casts the Rogue, recasts Gadul Lurker, and passes the turn.
In my turn, I cast Rayav Mastersmith and then move to combat. Here I attack Eric with Ardenn, who now has Double Strike in addition to all of his other keywords thanks to my Dwarf's ability. Unable to block, Eric takes a respectable 10 damage, and I then end my turn.
Danny once again puts the top 2 cards of his library into his graveyard with Sultai Ascendancy, revealing them to be Simic Growth Chamber and the Scarab God. Next he plays Rogue's Passage, pays a life to Mana Confluence, and casts the Stitches Supplier in his graveyard thanks to Muldrotha's ability. He mills Sidisi Brood Tyrant, Polluted Delta and Talarian Winds with the Zombies ETB, and then casts Hadana's Climb. Moving to combat, Danny puts a +1/+1 counter on Muldrotha and attacks Jace with his Swampy Elemental. Eric blocks with Spell Seeker, and with nothing more to do, Danny passes to Phil. Phil responds by cycling the Zargoth Triumph that he has in his hand, and then proceeds to his turn.
Phil puts Setesian Champion onto the battlefield of his Prismatic Bridge, and then casts Enchantress's Presence. He gains 2 life, draws 2 cards, puts a +1/+1 counter on his champion, and puts Murmuring Bosk into his hand from the top of his library.
My word, Phil has a seriously synergistic board state.
Tell me about it. Phil then plays a fancy Scalding Tarn, discards down to 7, and passes the turn.
Eric starts his turn by casting Soul Ring, and then casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Phil responds this by paying 1 life and sacrificing his fetchland to put Ketria Triumph into play tapped, and then everybody apart from Eric scoops up all their non-land permanents. Keeping with tradition, Eric activates Jace's +1 ability, drawing a card and forcing Martin to mill 2. He then plays an island, casts Portent, and rearranges the top 3 cards of his library. Moving to combat, Eric attacks Martin with Yuriko and Tetsuko, and Phil with Akiri and his Lurker. With neither defending player having any creatures to block with, Martin takes 2, Phil takes 4, and Yuriko's ability triggers. Eric reveals the top card of his library to be Changeling Outcast, dealing Martin, Danny and Phil 1 damage each, and Eric moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he casts the 1-mana Shapeshifter, and then ends his turn.
In my upkeep, Eric draws a card thanks to Portent, and I let out a deep sigh having not drawn a land yet again.
Have you seriously drawn a single land this entire game?
Eric keeps milling it all. Anyway, I recast Rayav and use my 1 remaining mana to recast Commander's Plate. I then discard down to 7 and pass to Danny.
Danny begins his turn by recasting Stitcher's Supplier, milling 2 land, and Tamio, Collector of Tales with their ETB. He then takes 2 damage from his lands in order to cast his commander, the Mimeoplasm. Danny has the legendary Ooze enter as a copy of Torrent Elemental and exiles the Sidisi Brood Tyrant in his graveyard to have it enter with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Happy to have finally cast his commander, Danny passes the turn.
In his turn, Phil recasts Utopia Sprawl, this time enchanting his Temple Garden. He then uses the enchanted land to recast Sterling Grove, recast the Prismatic Bridge, and plays Murmuring Bosque before discarding down to 7 and ending his turn.
Eric plays a swamp and activates Jace's +1 ability. He draws, Martin mills 2, and Eric then moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with all 4 of his unblockable creatures, dealing him 4 damage. This triggers Yuriko's ability twice thanks to the Shapeshifter's Changeling ability, and Eric reveals the top 2 cards of his library to be Thoughtseize and Swansong.
He really isn't having much luck with this ability, is he?
Everyone other than Eric takes 2 damage, and Eric moves to his second main phase. Here he casts the Thoughtseize he just put into his hand, losing 2 life and targeting Phil with the sorcery. Phil shows his hand to the rest of the table, and Eric decides to make him discard the Scarab God, given that Danny's deck revolves around putting powerful creatures into his graveyard.
A smart decision by Eric there.
Pleased with his turn, Eric discards down to 7 and passes to Martin.
I draw yet another non-land card, recast Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist, and move to combat. Here I attach my Commander's Plate to Reav using Ardenn's ability, attack Eric with the Dwarf, and he declares no blocks. Eric takes 10 damage thanks to Reav giving himself double strike, and I then pass the turn.
Danny plays Command Tower and recasts Hadana's Climb. He then moves to combat where he uses his enchantment's trigger to put a +1/+1 counter on his commander, transforming his climb into Winged Temple of Orazka. Next, Danny attacks Eric with his flying commander and takes 1 damage to double the Mimeoplasm's power with his newly flipped land. Unable to block the flying ooze, Eric takes 14 damage, lowering his life total to 0 and knocking him out of the game. Martin regains control of Akiri,
Thank Urza.
and with nothing more to do, Danny ends his turn.
Phil begins his turn by putting Satyr Enchanter into play with his bridge, and then casts Doomwake Giant. He draws a card from his enchanter, and the giant gives all of Danny and my creatures -1/-1. This kills Stitch's Supplier, milling Danny for 3, and putting Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger and 2 swamps into Danny's graveyard.
Yikes.
Indeed. Phil then plays the command tower that he just drew and casts Dance of the Manse, where X is 3. He returns Enchantress's Presence and Temur Ascendancy to play, giving Danny and my creatures a further -2/-2, taking out both of my commanders in the process. Lacking the mana to cast any more troublesome enchantments, Phil passes to me.
Martin once again fails to draw a land, meaning that he does not have enough mana to cast either of his commanders.
Tough times.
He instead decides to cast Unquestioned Authority, giving his dwarf protection from creatures in addition to the Sultai colour combination, and draws a card with the aura's ETB. This turns out to be a mountain, which he immediately slams onto the battlefield, and then moves to combat. Here Martin attacks Phil with his unblockable creature, dealing him 10 damage, and leaving Danny with a difficult decision next turn.
So you have the power to kill Phil, or the power to hit me and not kill me?
Unable to do anything else with his remaining 1 mana, Martin passes the turn.
In his turn, Danny moves straight to combat, attacking Phil with his 7/9 flying commander. He doubles the creature's power with his Winged Temple, dealing Phil enough damage to knock him out of the game, and moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he casts Maelstrom Pulse, destroying my commander's plate, and ends his turn.
Martin draws, sighs as he once again misses his land drop, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny, dealing him a measly 4 damage, discards down to 7, and passes the turn.
Danny starts his turn by casting Emrakul, the Promised End, and I respond to this by casting Generous Gift, destroying his commander. Danny receives a lovely 3/3 elephant token as compensation for the Mimeoplasm's death, and unable to attack this turn, he ends his turn.
Martin begins his turn by revealing his hand, given that Danny has full control of his actions right now.
All hail the giant spaghetti monster and her influential ways!
Seeing the lack of removal in Martin's hand, Danny decides to cast Martin's Boros Charm, having him deal 4 damage to himself.
I feel like there's a stop hitting yourself joke here somewhere, but I just can't bring myself to make it.
Unable to do anything else to mess up his turn, given that Reav has protection from creatures, Danny passes to Martin, who proceeds to his extra turn.
In my turn, I cast Sword of the Animist, equip it to my creature, and move to combat. I attack Danny with Rayav, dealing him 6 damage and putting a planes into play tapped with my sword's trigger.
For all the good it'll do, you know.
Alright, less of that sass please. Unable to avoid my imminent demise, I pass the turn.
Danny takes 1 damage from Mana Confluence in order to cast Plaguecrafter, forcing Martin to sacrifice his only creature.
There really wasn't any need for that now, was there?
The no kill like overkill. Speaking of which, Danny then casts Swiftfoot Boots for no reason other than he can, and moves to combat. Here he attacks with Emrakul, doubling her power with Adana's Climb and reducing Martin's life total to 0.
Well, that's it for another video. I hope that you enjoyed it. It turns out Danny's hand really was pure gas, but I still reckon I could have taken him if he hadn't played that darn Emrakul. Don't forget that you can help to support the channel in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting the bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read every one. And if you really like us, then consider becoming a patron of the channel. You can get rewards such as custom tokens, playmats, and the opportunity to play games with Alex and myself for as little as $1 a month. That's all for now though, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!